This show has been made with the help and support of Greg Parr.
Welcome to the Kiwi Mana Day.
Well, hello everybody and Happy New Year or Happy Holidays, whatever you're celebrating. And this is just a special little bonus issue for you guys. This is all about the way we used to be. This is New Zealand's first beekeeping podcast by a fantastic guy called Nick Wallingford. And he produced this in 2006, and he's given me permission to republish this because of the interest after the Nigel Costling interview. A few people have asked where they can access this podcast. And luckily, I had them on my hard drive on my computer, so I've kept them. And we're going to release them here. We've also put them on archive.org, so they're going to be there for future generations, hopefully. And these little shows, they're only 5 to 10 minutes. But they're talking about the history of New Zealand beekeeping and the characters and incidents that have shaped the industry in New Zealand over the last 100 years. I found it really interesting, so I just wanted to share this with you guys. Got a blog post there too, which will be coming out, whether you can actually play these shows individually. But this little show here is all the episodes. It's 8 episodes, so total it's about an hour-ish. So I hope you can sit back and enjoy them. You know, these are from 2006, but they're still very relevant because they're stories about the history of New Zealand beekeeping. So sit back and have a listen, and thanks to Nick for allowing us to do this. And Nick, if you're worrying about Nick's accent, he's actually originally from Texas, and he moved here in 1974 to be the president of the National Beekeepers Association, and also he's been an instructor for beekeeping. And now Nick is 67 and he's chilling out in the Bay of Plenty, retired. So this is his podcast. We'll start with episode 1, which is the introductions.
Welcome to this first installment of The Way We Used to Be podcast. My name is Nick Wallingford. I'm going to be producing these podcasts on a probably fairly irregular basis. At this stage, I'm hoping to aim for at least one podcast a week, perhaps even a little bit more frequently. I've been a New Zealand beekeeper for just over 30 years now, even though I don't have any beehives at the moment. But my interest in the last few years especially has been in the history of New Zealand beekeeping. I plan to use this podcast as a way of recording some of the stories about the history of beekeeping and marketing that I've found particularly interesting. And for those of you who know my interest in computing, I'm also using it as a way to get more familiar with the medium in general. So as a way of pushing the beekeeping industry into yet another electronic field, this is, as far as I know, the first beekeeping podcast that's around. If you don't know much about podcasts, at this stage I'd suggest you probably go ask a teenager. The medium is very popular these days, and once you get used to it, not all that demanding in terms of knowing how to work your devices so that you can get these podcasts downloaded to a iPod or some other sort of MP3 player on a regular basis without a lot of work. First off, for this session, I'm not going to be going into very much history at all. I'll really just be talking about why I'm doing this and what I hope to cover in podcasts into the future. It will be a short one. The name. First off, The Way We Used to Be. About 20 years ago, I used to write a column for the New Zealand Beekeeper magazine, and I must have written it probably for about a year and a half or 2 years. And as far as I'm aware, the only feedback that ever came to the editor or to me about the information I supplied in those articles was someone who thought it was such a neat title to the magazine article. I didn't have anything to do with that one. That was actually Trevor, the beekeeping editor of the day, who came up with the Way We Used to Be tag. I spent the time with those articles doing basically the same thing I'm going to be trying with this podcast, trying to take some of the history of New Zealand beekeeping and marketing and make it a little bit alive and interesting and modern again. So, in fact, a few of these episodes I'll probably go back and resurrect some of my columns from those days. to talk about the gadgets and the individuals of New Zealand beekeeping. The stories will almost always relate to characters. New Zealand beekeeping is full of strong-willed beekeeping characters over the years, and to a great extent they have strongly influenced the events and the marketing of the last years in beekeeping. This podcast will never go back further than about 1910. For some reason, that's about the year when I actually take an interest in the industry. It's not to say there wasn't beekeeping before then. There's some very interesting things, but it's just not been my particular forte. So a lot of my stories will relate to the industry and the associations that have been involved in the industry and the people who made up those associations. So I'll be talking to a great extent about the National Beekeepers Association, but also such organizations as the Honey Producers Association and others. I'll be talking quite a bit about publications, because to a great extent that's where I've gotten my information about historical beekeeping. And I'll be telling some funny stories and a few sad stories of both incidents and people that have affected our industry over these last 100 years. So with that, I think I'll close this first session. As I say, I'm not going to tell any historical stories with this one, but I hope that from now on, each session will run to maybe 5 minutes of talking, maybe 10 at the most, and I'll try to keep them fairly specific to a particular topic, to a particular character, or to a particular incident within the industry during that time. I'm always interested in hearing from you. If any of you have any other stories related to what I might say, or have some written documentation, or any old photographs, I would really, really like the opportunity to hear from you. You can write to me either at my own address, nickw@beekeeping.co.nz, or I'll set up an address called history@beekeeping.co.nz. I do hope you'll take the time to write to me and comment on the stories and let me know of things that you'd like to actually hear about in these podcasts. Thank you very much, and I look forward to producing the next podcast for you. The music in today's podcast comes from Olivier Rogge and Lee Mediford. The song is called Song for Madeline. Welcome to episode 2 of The Way We Used to Be. My name is Nick Wallingford. Today's music comes from Averil Jarloff. Today's episode combines two of the best types of historical stories, those about people and those about gadgets. The special person I'm going to be talking about today is Peter Pegram, and the gadget is what I would count as the world's simplest honey extractor. I first met Peter back in 1974 when he gave a talk to a beekeeper's seminar in Taupo. The next year I met his wife Snow, and over the years visited with them a number of times. Peter was talking at the time about how difficult it was to extract Manuka honey. It was many, many years before Manuka honey began to get a premium price that actually made his business so much more profitable. His earlier days of beekeeping were much harder. Peter joined the industry as one of the returned servicemen at the end of World War II. When I was trying to remember who some of those other servicemen were, the only two that came to mind for me at the time were Dudley Lorimer from Hamilton in the Waikato and Stuart Tweedale, who was resettled into Taihape. At the time, any of the returned servicemen who took up beekeeping were pretty well assigned an area, and often those areas would have been pretty hard to make a living from. Fraser Town in the Wairoa area would have been especially hard in the late 40s and early 50s. Transport, the opportunity to get materials in, and even the access roads for where you had to put your beehives must have been pretty hard back in those days. The gadget I wanted to talk about today was one that Peter showed me many years ago. I don't think Peter knew where it had originated from, but I would have guessed it would have been early in the century. It would have been the world's easiest honey extractor. Not motorized and no moving parts. It basically consisted of a broomstick, just a stick about 30 or 40 mils in diameter and about a meter and a half tall, and fitted to the bottom of the stick was something that resembled the basket in a honey extractor now, except it wouldn't have been open. It was actually closed galvanized iron, so that it had a slot at the top where the frame, after it had been uncapped, could be inserted, and then you simply twirled the stick around. The base of the stick poked into the ground, and the top of the stick going around in a circle as you spun it. The honey presumably came out. It couldn't have been very fast or very efficient. And after spinning the honey from one side, you could remove the frame, turn it over, and spin from the other side. There was enough of a collecting area at the bottom of the little basket to hold the honey that came from the frame, and I believe it had a hole with a cork at the very bottom so that after extracting the honey, you could run it out of the basket and get ready to extract the next frame. I've never seen any other pictures or any other descriptions of an extractor like that. I'm assuming it must have come from fairly early in the 20th century. After box hives were on their way out, presumably, so it was designed for movable frame extraction. But I don't know where he would have gotten it from or where the beekeeper who had it originally may have come up with the idea even. That's just one more story of New Zealand beekeeping history and some of the characters that have made it so interesting to me. The music on the podcast comes from Avril Jarlov, and my name is Nick Wallingford. If any of you want to write to me with any more information about returned servicemen or some other aspect of New Zealand beekeeping history, you can write to history@beekeeping.co.nz. Thank you very much, and I look forward to recording the next episode.
Yeah, everything's been said. Yeah, everything's been said. Yeah, everything's been said.
Welcome to episode 3 of The Way We Used to Be. My name is Nick Wallingford, and once again the music for this episode comes from Avril Jarlov. This episode, once again, is going to join gadgets and characters, but I'm going to need a little bit of help from you listeners for this one because I don't actually know the whole story. The character for tonight is Allan Bates. Allan Bates started his beekeeping in Taranaki probably in the late 1915, 1920 times. By 1920, he was definitely established in Taranaki, living in Kaponga, I believe. And in 1920, he was actually elected to the executive of the National Beekeepers Association. I met Allan in 1975 at a Waikato field day, and can remember him very clearly sitting up at the front of the meeting with an ear trumpet, hard of hearing, but still wanting to know everything that was being said during the field day. When I first started beekeeping in New Zealand, it was in Taranaki in 1974, and some of the bee sites that we had been originally established by Allan Bates. I remember one in particular up near Mount Egmont with a beautiful stream nearby, and being told that Allan Bates always picked his bee sites to be close to good fly fishing streams. He liked his trout fishing as much as he liked his beekeeping. Allan moved to Matamata with his beekeeping business at some point after the 1920s. I don't know exactly when, and was still involved there, as I say, until the 1975 or later, with Cliff Bird, a well-known character, as a manager for his business. Where the gadgets come into it is my memory of having been pointed out a shed in Kaponga, Taranaki, that I think belonged to Allan's nephew, and the two gadgets that I had been told that were produced there had been a honey creamer and a honey packing machine. Now, I'm not really sure whether it was a nephew or some other relation of Allan Bates who made the two machines. I do know that there probably are still a few of the honey packers and the honey creaming machines still around. So if someone can actually tell me a little bit more about the story, I'd be glad to finish it off properly. The honey creamer was not the normal mix in a little bit of granulated honey and let the rest of it set, but rather it was of the honey grinder. It was a device to pump pretty well granulated honey through a grinding device and make it into a creamed mixture. Not the creamed honey that most beekeepers know and that New Zealand is famous for. So if someone can actually set me straight on who was it that actually invented the Bates packing machine and the Bates honey creamer, I would really appreciate it. As always, you can write to me at history@beekeeping.co.nz, and I'll be glad to add that to one of the future episodes of this, The Way We Used to Be. With that, I'd like to say thank you once again. The music, again this evening, is from Avril Jarlov, and my name is Nick Wallingford. Thank you for listening.
But it's still undone. Yeah, everything's been said. 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 Yeah, everything's been said.
Welcome to the fourth episode of The Way We Used to Be. Today's talk is about Trevor Palmer Jones. Trevor Palmer Jones was New Zealand's chief beekeeping scientist from the early 1930s until about 1970. An interesting sidelight, one time I asked him what he thought was the most amazing scientific advance during that time, and he immediately answered the photocopier. He said that back in the 1930s, it was a real problem trying to get a good beekeeping library, because you might read an article in a bee magazine, but you couldn't keep a copy of it for your own files. You would have to write a letter to the person overseas and have them send you a copy, one of the off-prints, the reprints that they were given each time they had an article published. I met Palmer Jones in the early 1980s after he was retired and living in an apartment in Wellington. I talked with him for several hours one evening, going through the history of beekeeping as he knew it and the things that he had been involved in. Probably his most important activity through the 30s and 40s was involved in poisonous honey, what we now know as toot poisoning, caused by the toot plant. At that point was still something of a mystery. Palmer Jones and C.R. Patterson, one of the apiary advisors of the time, are credited with having both discovered that it was the toot plant that caused the poisoning and that it was the bees gathering the honeydew from the toot plant during certain seasons that caused the poisoning. Palmer Jones talked quite a bit about the methodology that he used, how he had to develop a way of to determine whether the honey was poisonous or not. He would inject it into guinea pigs. I can't remember the word, but it's straight into their stomach, which is a pretty serious thing. And I know there are quite a few arguments still going on at the quantity of honey that he was putting into a small guinea pig and the fact that maybe the sugar would have killed the guinea pig anyway. Palmer Jones was quite convinced that his methodology was sound, but he did think it was quite wasteful, all the mini guinea pigs that he was killing with the testing for poisonous honey. Just out of curiosity, he decided he'd learn how to revive them, and he discovered that after they had been injected with poisonous honey, if you could inject them with some barbiturates, they would actually revive again. Now, he wasn't able to reuse these same guinea pigs, apparently for science. Once they've been done like that one time, that would invalidate it the next time. But it was just scientific curiosity that Palmer Jones worked through in trying to save these guinea pigs. The evening I was interviewing Palmer Jones, his wife was there as well. His wife was very Germanic with still a very strong accent and a very committed belief to Eastern religions and yoga. Several times when he was talking about the killing of the guinea pigs, she would interject about his karma was destroyed forever. How could he possibly have killed all these poor little creatures during that time? Palmer Jones told a story of sometime in about the 1930s, not long after he had discovered that barbiturates were an antidote to toot poisoning. Back in those days, when circuses traveled through New Zealand, they would travel either by train or by truck and trailers through the country. And during this time, there was a circus train or truck caravan, I wasn't exactly sure, traveling through the Bay of Plenty area. Now, elephants, even if they were confined into a truck or a trailer, could still reach their trunks out quite a ways, and apparently this elephant, while traveling, had grabbed a bunch of toot plant from the side of the road and eaten it. So here is this elephant that's actually been dying of toot poisoning. Now, it's not the poisonous toot honey, but in fact the same neurotoxin poison that came from the toot plant. Fortunately, the veterinarian who had the elephant there in Whakatane area had read of Trevor Palmer Jones's work and found that the barbiturates were in fact a possible antidote to the toot poisoning. The veterinarian, on Palmer Jones' advice, ended up stuffing several bucket loads of barbiturates, was the way that Palmer Jones described it, into this elephant. And surprisingly, the elephant actually survived. With this, Palmer Jones looked up at his wife and he says, from a scientific point of view, that elephant weighed an awful lot. I'll bet even though I killed a whole lot of small guinea pigs, that based on body weight, my karma must still be okay, having saved that one elephant with the science that I did. That's the end of this session. My name is Nick Wallingford. I'll be bringing you these stories hopefully at least once a week. And the music for this evening's episode comes, as always, from Avril Jarloff. If you'd like to write to me about this story or any other history stories of New Zealand beekeeping, I'd be very pleased to hear from you. You can write to me at history@beekeeping.co.nz. Thank you for listening.
Everything's been said. Yeah, everything's been said. Yeah, everything's been said. Yeah, everything's been said.
Welcome to this episode of The Way We Used to Be. My name is Nick Wallingford, and I'm continuing this series of stories about New Zealand beekeeping and the history, the people who made the industry what it is today. This session is actually going to talk about one of the beekeeping families that have had such a strong influence on the industry over a long period of time. Without having to think very hard about it, I came up with at least 4 families that have had 3 generations of activity within the industry. The Bray family, the Berry family, the Gavins, and the Penroses are all, for certain in my mind, families that have had 3 generations of people active in the full-time commercial beekeeping industry. I'm sure there's some others, so if you could actually write a few of those to me, I'd like to add those to the list. Today's story is about the Bray family, and with Peter Bray still in the industry, I'm sure I can get a few more additions to it at some point to add to the things that I'm saying today. In 1908, W.B. Bray, also known as Billy, was appointed the inspector for the South Island of New Zealand. Not just one of the inspectors, he was the inspector for the entire island. And it's of Billy Bray that the story is told about the bicycle traveling over the entire island. In fact, he had a railroad pass as well. And as far as I'm aware, the bicycle that people refer to is in fact a motorized bicycle, a motorbike. I have a photo of that somewhere in my archives. By 1910, Billy Bray and his partner Alf Barrett were actually beekeeping on the Banks Peninsula outside of Christchurch. It would have been a pretty wild era back then, and transport would have been rough, but they were making a good living, with two families making a full living out of 300 beehives. By 1915, Billy had expanded into the politics of the industry and was on the NBA executive. In 1916 was the first writings I can find where he actually was on record as favoring cooperation and stability within the industry, with the line, "We want to ride a motor car too someday," describing his hopes for the increasing ability of the industry to actually control its own destiny. By 1917, he was both the executive secretary and the editor of the NBA's magazine, although he missed the conference in 1917, having been called up to military service only 1 week before. Following the war period, there was an acrimonious exchange between WB and the editor of the magazine, with the editor sending back WB's money and telling him that he too was sorry that WB had sent in a subscription. WB was an irascible sort of an old fellow. He spoke his mind, I think, pretty clearly. By the 1920s, he was living in Leaston, where the current airborne honey is, and it was in 1926 that the airborne honey brand was actually established, making it, I believe, the longest established brand of honey within the country now. In 1929, he was actually promoting strongly the idea of local consumption with a strong advertising base. That is, in an industry that had faced a lot of marketing problems, WB reckoned that the solution was to really promote honey as a food item and actually advertise it more so that people would value it, hoping to actually sell a greater proportion of the honey within New Zealand rather than having to export onto what was at that point a pretty erratic market. In July of 1929, WB started producing the New Zealand Honey Producer magazine. The magazine didn't last for very long, but the most interesting aspect that came out of it, to my mind, was its motto, "Better beekeeping, better marketing." When I came into the industry in 1975, that was the well-established motto of the NBA, but no one I'd ever spoke with actually knew anything about its history. So it wasn't until I actually came across WB's first magazine that I knew where the phrase had actually originated. Through the 1930s and up to 1945, WB was still very active in the industry, primarily as an opposition to the then Honey Producers Association, which will be a story of its own at some point. In 1945, he produced a pamphlet of his own called An Examination of Honey Marketing Problems, describing the early period of honey marketing and what he saw as the potential for what the industry could do. In the foreword to the booklet, WB wrote, "If it appears that the personal pronoun has been used too often, my excuse is that it is inevitable. I've taken an active part and have expressed my individuality without fear." After World War II, Alf Barrett retired from the business, and WB's son, Jasper Bray, took over Alf's interests. By 1950, Arthur Gossett, who had worked for the company for some years before then, took an active interest into the company as well when WB retired. By 1957, the company established itself as Bray and Gossett, a well-known brand within the industry for many years. And in 1980, Peter Bray moved into the company as well, and Arthur Gossett retired in 1982. I remember Arthur well, with great pleasure, having worked with him in the late 70s when I worked for Airborne Honey. By 1997, Airborne Honey had actually gotten rid of its hives and became solely a honey packing and marketing company. The Bray family is just one of many three-generation families within the industry, and I'd like to be able to go into this amount of detail for several of the others, but I don't have all the information I need. So if some of the people from those families would be willing to share stories and perhaps even photographs with me, I'd be pleased to actually extend my understanding of how they've affected the industry as well. Thank you for listening to today's session. If you would like to send me a message to tell me anything about the stories I've told or to suggest some others, you can write to me at history@beekeeping.co.nz. Thank you very much. The music for today, as always, comes from Avril Jarloff.
Everything's been said. Everything's been said. Everything's been said.
Welcome to the next episode of The Way We Used to Be. My name is Nick Wallingford, and I bring you these short stories of New Zealand beekeeping history. Today's session will be fairly short. It's not a very long story, but it was one that was told to me about 30 years ago. I went to just about all of the National Beekeeper Association conferences through my early years in the industry. One of the early conferences I went to was in Dunedin. I believe it was 1976. And during one evening of storytelling and whiskey drinking, I ended up sitting in a motel room with Jack Fraser and Kevin Ecroyd, two well-known and respected people of the industry through those periods. And they told a story about a beekeeper who will remain anonymous for this story, and his honey sales to the Honey Marketing Authority. It seems that this beekeeper was of the rather sneaky variety who was determined to try and get a better payout for his honey than he probably deserved. In the first instance, when he sold to the HMA, he sold by sample, sent them a sample of the honey. They took his 60-pound tins and put them into store. When they did get around to melting them out and mixing them, blending them with other containers of honey based on their color and flavor as determined by the sample, it turned out that this batch ended up a lot darker and stronger flavored than it should have been. There was no way of proving anything. They just assumed it may well have been him having slipped a few 60-pound tins of a darker, stronger honey in with his clover that he was purporting the whole lot to be. So they just thought to themselves, well, we need to be a little more careful. The next time this same beekeeper submitted honey to the HMA, they weren't going to accept his own sample. So they went and sampled each of the 60-pound tins. They were granulated for travel, but they took the lids off and took a sample of the granulated honey to make sure that it was in fact, light colored as it was supposed to be. Once again, they put the tins into storage. When they melted them out and poured them into the blending mix again, lo and behold, if it wasn't dark and strong flavored. What they finally figured out he had done was to actually fill the tins about 2/3 of the way full of dark honey and let it granulate, and then just topped it up with light-colored honey up at the top of the tin, so that when the sample was taken, it was in fact light, but the predominant flavor was strong and the honey itself was quite dark. Once again, the HMA people at the time thought, well, we need to be very careful around this guy. If he ever cheats us again, we're not going to ever deal with him. But they hadn't been able to pin anything on him for certain. So the next season rolled around, and he submitted another batch of honey, tins for sale. This time they weren't going to let him get away with that. So they took the sample from the bottom of the container. They stuck a probe all the way, a sampling device all the way down to the bottom of the honey tin through the opening, and took the sample from, well down in the container. Once again, it was light colored, nice flavored. Once again, they melted the tins out, and once again, for the last time, the batch was ruined by the strong flavored, dark colored honey that came out of these tins. I don't know how they finally figured it out, but what they determined that he had probably done this time was to fill the container about 3/4 of the way full of dark honey, but instead of letting it granulate at the bottom of the tin, he turned the tins up on edge so that the opening was at the top, but the tin was lying on its side. Let it granulate, and then fill the resulting chimney all the way down to the bottom of the container with light-colored honey again, so that even though they had sampled all the way down to the bottom, he still managed to fool them. At that stage, Jack Fraser and Kevin Ecroyd were just laughing about how they had been taken, how this beekeeper had managed to 3 times cheat the HMA and get a better payout. But they just said at that stage they just refused to ever take any more honey from the guy. Thank you for listening to the story once again. My name is Nick Wallingford. If you're ever interested in writing to me about any of these stories or any stories you'd like to tell me, you can email me at history@beekeeping.co.nz. The music for today is by Avril Jarlov. Again, thank you for listening.
Everything's been said. Everything's been said. Everything's been said.
Welcome once again to episode 7 of this podcast called The Way We Used to Be. My name is Nick Wallingford, and I use these podcasts to tell stories about the characters and the events that have shaped New Zealand beekeeping history. Today's episode revolves around a character by the name of Jack Glenn. I met Jack in the early 1980s, about the time he was pretty well retired. Jack had spent quite a bit of his life on the West Coast, but his beekeeping was really in Southland, where he was a very successful beekeeper during the period of time when Southland was one of the finest places to raise good white clover honey. By the time I met Jack, he was spending a lot of his time traveling back and forth between the West Coast and Southland, visiting with people variously, and telling some good stories. The story I was going to tell about Jack was something he mentioned to me at that time when we were talking about different ways of selling honey. Most people have some idea of the fact that New Zealand beekeepers were some of the first to seriously know how to produce good quality creamed honey. But Jack told me a story about a period before that time when beekeepers were looking at innovative ways of preparing their honey for market. What he described was the process of granulating honey in a 60-pound tin with one of the sides cut open. So rather than having the top cut, it was actually one of the rectangular large sides, so that you'd have a great big 60-pound block of hard granulated honey. In this case, the trick wasn't to try and make it granulate smoothly and soft, but rather granulate it as hard as it would granulate. After it was granulated, the beekeepers would shake the big block of honey out of the tin onto a workbench and then use a piece of piano wire with 2 handles, one on either end, to cut through the block of granulated honey. The trick, as Jack described it, was trying to cut the right-sized blocks. So if you can imagine taking this 60-pound tin of granulated honey block and cutting it into pieces about the size of a 500-gram butter container. In fact, they were aiming probably for, in those days, the 1 pound amount. Cutting it into these blocks and then wrapping the blocks into grease-proof paper. Once again, very much like the packaging of butter. So the honey was actually a hard block of honey wrapped into grease-proof paper, just like a block of butter. Jack said it was never particularly successful, but it was at least another way of providing honey, and it could pack and travel reasonably well as long as the temperature was cold. But he said that during the summer it was pretty useless as a product. You can imagine it would get quite sloppy and messy. I last saw Jack about that same time. I believe he died in the late 1980s, and I wished I would have had a few more chances to meet with him and hear some of his good stories. Thanks once again for listening to the podcast. My name is Nick Wallingford. The music for today comes from Avril Jarloff. If any of you have any stories of your own that you'd like to tell me, be sure to write to me at history@beekeeping.co.nz. Thanks again.
Everything's been said. Everything's been said. Everything's been said.
Welcome to the Way We Used to Be podcast. My apologies for not having any episode up in the last several weeks, but I've been quite busy. Today's session is going to cover the history of Percy Hillary, Sir Edmund Hillary's father, and his involvement in the marketing of New Zealand honey in the 1920s and 1930s. Percy Hillary must have entered the industry sometime in the mid-1920s, coming from a background of journalism. He was a newspaper publisher at the time with a home base in Tuakau, just south of Auckland. At this time, middle 1920s, the Honey Producers Association was primarily responsible for obtaining overseas markets for New Zealand honey and coordinating the exports. And the local market was pretty much in a bad conditions. Money was hard to get in beekeeping generally. So the period was marked by a lot of arguments over what direction marketing should take. My reason for talking about Percy Hillary today was the pivotal role that he seemed to play in a lot of the marketing decisions of that era. Percy Hillary was elected vice president of the National Beekeepers Association in 1928 and was sitting in the chair at the conference in 1929 as the president had not been available for conference. The meeting was faced with a situation of a local market in pretty bad shape due to large honey crops, of all things. Those of you who are involved in marketing know that exceptionally large crops can cause as much problem as small crops. So the large crops of the late 1920s, 1927-28 and 1928-29, had both caused a lot of problems, resulting in price cutting on the local market and a lot of competition on the export markets, which again kept the prices down. People were only using the Honey Producers Association when it suited them, which made it pretty difficult for the organization to effectively coordinate the marketing activities. So there was a strong feeling among some beekeepers that a form of acquisition, a compulsory acquisition of honey for export, or maybe even all honey, would be of value. I would say that Percy Hillary probably fell into that camp from what I could tell. Their marketing scheme was called the contract scheme, where beekeepers would forward contract their honey production to the HPA, giving it the assurance of enough honey to sell in the years that it could sell honey overseas. The other side of the issue was probably dominated by William Bray, Billy Bray, that I spoke of in a previous podcast. He felt strongly enough about it that he started his own magazine in July of 1929 and followed on from that with a scheme to increase advertising to try and promote the local consumption of honey. In 1929, Percy Hillary won the Hopkins Memorial Essay Competition, basically with a paper about how to produce good queens. My understanding is that it was Percy Hillary's wife who was the actual queen rearer of the family. In late 1929, Percy Hillary started his own newspaper for the Auckland branch called the Alighting Board, again reflecting on his journalistic background. The Honey Producers Association, in trying to achieve the coordination of the industry, had set a goal of 75% of the 1,200 producers. And though it claimed to almost make that in August, by the end of the year it was clear that the industry didn't really favor the forward contracting ideas of the Honey Producers Association. Percy Hillary was involved in a lot of the decisions of the Honey Producers Association at this time, and one of the other bad events of the time came about with a record failure of crop in 1930. It was only about 1/3 of the previous season's crop. In 1931, Percy Hillary moved on to the board of directors of the Honey Producers Association and was elected as president of the NBA. So you can imagine for the next few years he would be a pivotal decision maker within marketing and national beekeeping politics. The Local Honey Marketing Act gave the HPA the ability to control the local market, if you will, and it was actually attempting to provide coordination by developing what was called an equalization fund. Those of you who know the later history of honey marketing may well recognize that as one of the tenets of the Honey Marketing Authority in the period 30 years later than this. By 1932, it was a very dangerous time to be around beekeeping marketing. The Honey Producers Association went into voluntary liquidation on the 26th of July, and this was only one day before the NBA conference on the 27th and 28th July with Percy Hillary in the chair. You can imagine there would have been quite a spectacular amount of debate going on at the conference. The period was characterized by not only the depression in a world sense, but price cutting within the New Zealand honey marketing in a dramatic way. Percy Hillary described the two primary failures of the previous year being the failure of the honey crop and the failure of competitive open marketing. There was price cutting, which really must have resulted in one of the worst times for beekeeping ever. In 1932, Percy Hillary was once again elected as president, and one of the interesting things at that conference was a proposal by Wallace Nelson, who figures into beekeeping marketing quite a lot from this point on. Wallace Nelson described the concept of a seal that could be attached to honey for beekeepers who were not supplying the coordinating honey marketing authority of the day. That is, a seal that would provide an assurance for the consumer of the quality of the honey being provided. That seal proposal eventually resulted in what other beekeepers would now know as the seals levy. The 1933 conference saw Percy Hillary stepping down as president, but still on the executive. And again, in 34 and 35, he continued to work on the executive while working with the New Zealand Honey Company and the Honey Control Board, primarily in a coordinating role for export of honey and for the local market honey from the New Zealand Honey Company. The 1937 year really spelled a low time for beekeeping history as it relates to Percy Hillary. Percy Hillary at this point was on the Honey Control Board for the export of honey and on the New Zealand Honey Company Board of Directors. The bodies made some bad decisions and chose to import 100 tons of honey from Australia to meet a shortfall in the export market potential. There was never any intention, they said, to try and sell this as New Zealand honey, but William Bray, in making it all public and writing to the New Zealand beekeepers, made a very lively conference in 1937, which really probably caused quite a lot of damage to the coordinated marketing being handled by the New Zealand Honey Company and the Honey Control Board. In 1938, Percy Hillary resigned from the Honey Control Board along with Wallace Nelson, and the Internal Marketing Division took over New Zealand Honey Limited's business. At this point, the IMD accepted the responsibility for marketing of honey entirely, moving to a very regulated marketing of honey, backed by the Primary Products Marketing Act of 1938. This led eventually to the use of stamps for people who were not supplying their honey to the marketing authority, and the seals levy, which was introduced some years later, can be seen as the result of this approach, the idea that non-suppliers should have to actually attach a seal of some sort, which costs them money to compete against the coordinated marketing. Percy Hillary falls out of evidence in the Beekeeping magazine from this period, even though he continued to be a beekeeper into the 1950s. I would say that his reputation was pretty well damaged in the involvement with the honey sales from 1937, when the Australian honey was used to supplement New Zealand's honey for export. Percy Hillary was a very unusual-looking character. I have a few photographs of him, one speaking at a Ruakura field day and several others at his time at various NBA conferences. Someday I'd like to actually learn a little bit more about the involvement in the early days especially, and more about his family and its queen-rearing capabilities. If any of you would ever like to write to me about the way we used to be, you can write to me at history@beekeeping.co.nz. Thanks very much for listening. Once again, as always, the music behind today's podcast is from Avril Jarlov.
Everything's been said. Everything's been said. Everything's been said.
Okay, well, that's it. So thanks, guys, for listening to that. I hope you got something out of that and learned some interesting information. It was very interesting to hear about Sir Edmund Hillary's father, wasn't it, Percy Hillary? And all the different characters around in the word beekeeping world. And would love to get out there one day and meet some of these characters. Anyway, I hope you're having a great holiday season, and we will talk to you soon.